The key turned with a resistance that suggested years of disuse, metal scraping against metal in a way that made Sarah's teeth ache. She paused, with her hand still on the lock, feeling the weight of the iron key press into her palm, aware that on the other side of this door lay either salvation or the final confirmation of every poor decision she had made in the past 6 months. The building stood at the edge of Riverside, where the town's modest downtown gave way to industrial lots and empty storefronts that had once thrived when the mill was running. 3 stories of red brick, narrow windows dark with dust, a faded sign above the entrance that read Hartley's Camera, Emporium and Portrait Studio, in letters that had been painted over so many times the layers showed through like geological strata. From the sidewalk, it looked exactly like what it was: abandoned, forgotten, a relic from an era when people had their portraits taken once a year and treated the occasion with the solemnity of a ritual. Sarah had driven past it hundreds of times without really seeing it. The way you stop noticing buildings that have stood empty for so long, they become part of the landscape rather than structures with purpose. Until the auction notice appeared in her mailbox, forwarded from an address she barely remembered giving to anyone. Estate liquidation. Contents included. Sold as is. Minimum. Bid $500. The photograph on the listing showed the exterior, the sign, and nothing more. No interior shots. No inventory list. Just a date, a time, and the promise that whatever was inside would belong to whoever showed up willing to pay. Sarah had $1,200 in her checking account when she saw that notice. It was everything she had left after 3 months of unemployment, after the landlord's final warning, after her daughter Emma's school fees came due, and she had to choose between paying them or keeping the electricity on. $1,200 stood between them and the homeless shelter she had visited twice now, just to see what the intake process looked like, just to prepare herself for what might come next. She told herself she was being practical when she attended the auction. She told herself she was only going to observe, to see how these things worked, to understand whether the stories she had heard about people finding value in forgotten places had any truth to them. She told herself these things right up until she raised her hand. The auctioneer had opened the event with casual dismissiveness, explaining that most of the building's valuable equipment had been removed years ago by the previous owner's relatives. What remained was vintage photography equipment, darkroom materials, office furniture, and miscellaneous contents. He said it like a warning. The handful of people who had shown up seemed to agree. They circled the building once, peered through the filthy windows, and most of them left before the bidding even started. Sarah stayed because leaving meant returning to the apartment where Emma was staying with Mrs. Chen from downstairs, returning to the stack of rejection letters on the kitchen table, returning to the phone calls she couldn't answer because the numbers were collection agencies she had no way to satisfy. Staying meant possibility, however slim. The bidding opened at $500. Silence. The auctioneer dropped it to $400. A man in a contractor's vest glanced at the building, shook his head, and walked to his truck. $300. The auctioneer tried, his voice carrying less conviction now. Sarah looked at the brick facade, at the narrow windows, at the size of the space. 3 stories. Even if it held nothing but junk, that was a lot of junk. Enough to sell piecemeal, enough to stretch her remaining money another month or 2. $300 going once. She thought of Emma's shoes, the soles wearing through. She thought of the eviction notice folded in her purse, the date circled in red. $300 going twice. She thought of how tired she was of being afraid. Her hand went up. The auctioneer's relief was visible. Sold to number 47 for $300. Then he paused, consulting his notes. Plus $650 in outstanding property taxes and municipal fees. Total $950, due immediately. Sarah's stomach dropped. She wanted to take it back, to say she had misunderstood, but the words wouldn't come. The few remaining bidders were already leaving. The auctioneer was walking toward her with paperwork. She paid with her debit card, watching the numbers drain from her account, feeling each digit disappear like a physical loss. $1,200 became $250 in the time it took the transaction to process. The auctioneer handed her 2 keys, a thick ring of older ones that looked like they belonged in a museum themselves, and a business card with the city assessor's information. You've got 90 days to bring the property up to code or demonstrate intention to renovate, he said without much hope. After that, it goes back to the city. She stood alone on the sidewalk after he left, holding the keys, looking up at the building that now belonged to her. The afternoon sun caught the windows at an angle that made them look less like glass and more like black mirrors, reflecting nothing. Her phone buzzed. Mrs. Chen, asking when she would be home. Emma wanted to show her a drawing from school. Sarah replied that she would be there soon, then pocketed the phone and approached the door. The lock fought her. She had to jiggle the key, apply pressure in just the right way, before something inside gave and the mechanism turned. The door swung inward with a long creak that echoed into the darkness beyond. The smell hit her immediately. Dust, yes, but also chemicals, old paper, something metallic and sharp. Not decay exactly, but age concentrated and undisturbed. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her with a sound that felt too final. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the dimness. Light filtered weakly through the dirty windows, creating long shafts filled with suspended dust that moved in patterns too slow to be called motion. The front room was large, extending back into shadows her eyes couldn't quite penetrate. A reception desk stood to her right, its surface buried under papers that had yellowed into uniformity. Behind it, shelves lined the wall, still holding what looked like ledgers and files. To her left, a waiting area with chairs arranged in a semicircle, their upholstery torn and faded, but still somehow maintaining the posture they had held for decades. Photographs covered the walls, hundreds of them, portraits of people in dated clothing, their faces serious, their eyes following her as she moved. The floorboards creaked under her weight, announcing her presence to the empty space. She walked slowly toward the back of the room, her footsteps the only sound. At the rear, a doorway opened onto a staircase that led both up and down. A handwritten sign, barely legible, pointed upward. Studio. Another pointed down. Processing. Sarah stood at the junction and made a decision that felt random, but wasn't. She went down. The stairs were narrow and steep, each step groaning under her weight, as if testing whether she should be allowed to descend. The smell grew stronger as she went deeper, chemicals and darkness and something else she couldn't name. At the bottom, she found a light switch and flipped it, not expecting it to work. The fluorescent tube overhead stuttered, buzzed, and came to life with a reluctant hum. The light was harsh and uneven, but it was enough to see that she was standing in a hallway lined with doors. 4 on the left, 3 on the right, each one labeled in the same, careful handwriting she had seen upstairs. Darkroom 1, Darkroom 2, Storage, Chemical Prep, Archive. She tried the first door. Locked. The second, the same. The third opened into a small room, lined floor to ceiling with metal shelves, each one holding boxes of photographic paper, developing chemicals in bottles that looked older than she was, trays and tongs and equipment she couldn't identify. Everything was organized with a precision that suggested someone who cared deeply about their work. The fourth door resisted at first, then gave with a suddenness that made her stumble forward. She caught herself on the doorframe and looked inside. This room was different, larger. The shelves here held something else entirely. Cameras, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They lined every available surface, arranged by era and type with labels written in the same meticulous hand. Brownie box cameras from the early 1900s, Rolleiflex, twin-lens reflex models, Leicas, Hasselblads, Polaroid land cameras still in their original cases. Some she recognized from museum exhibits she had taken Emma to when money had been less tight. Others were completely foreign, their mechanisms visible through glass panels, their brass fittings tarnished but intact. Sarah stepped inside, her breath catching. This wasn't junk. This was a collection, a serious one. She pulled out her phone and began searching, typing model numbers into auction sites and collector forums. The numbers that came back made her hands shake. $200 for a common Kodak, $800 for a vintage Leica, $2,000 for a Rolleiflex in good condition. She did rough mental math, counting visible cameras, estimating conservatively, and arrived at a figure that seemed impossible. Even if she was wrong by half, even if most of these cameras were broken or missing parts, the value here was easily 10 times what she had paid for the building. Her legs went weak. She sat down on a wooden stool near the door and let the reality wash over her. She had not made a mistake. She had not thrown away her last money on nothing. She had bought something real. The relief was so intense it hurt. She put her head in her hands and breathed, feeling the pressure that had lived in her chest for months begin to ease. Just slightly. This could work. She could sell the cameras, pay off her debts, keep the apartment, give Emma stability. The future, which had seemed like a locked door, suddenly showed light underneath. She stood and explored further, opening cabinets, checking drawers, documenting everything with her phone camera. The collection was extensive, more than extensive. It was obsessive. Every era of photography represented, every major manufacturer. Accessories organized in separate boxes, lenses, filters, tripods, lighting equipment. Instruction manuals, preserved in plastic sleeves. Original receipts tucked into envelopes, marked with purchase dates, going back to the 1,940 seconds. Whoever had built this collection had not been casual about it. This had been a life's work. She found a small desk in the corner of the room, its surface covered with a layer of dust so thick it looked like fabric. When she brushed it away, she uncovered a notebook. The cover was leather, worn smooth by handling. The pages inside filled with the same careful handwriting that appeared throughout the building. She opened it and began to read. It was a log, each entry dated, each camera acquired noted with its condition, its price, and a brief comment. The entries started in 1952 and continued, regular as clockwork, for decades. The handwriting changed subtly over the years, growing shakier near the end, but the dedication never wavered. The last entry was dated 6 years ago. Nikon F3, mint condition, estate sale, $150, perfect focusing, perfect light seals, perfect. Sarah closed the notebook carefully and set it back on the desk. She felt like she was intruding on something private, a relationship between a person and their passion that she couldn't fully understand. But she was also grateful. Whatever drove this person to collect, to preserve, to organize with such care, had also saved her. She spent the next hour exploring the other rooms on the basement level. One held developing equipment, enlargers and timers, and graduates for measuring chemicals. Another was a proper darkroom, the walls painted black, a red safe light still hanging from the ceiling. She flipped the switch experimentally, and the bulb glowed to life, casting everything in crimson. The sight of it startled her. After 6 years of neglect, the fact that anything still worked felt like a small miracle. The last door, at the end of the hallway, was different from the others. Heavier, the wood darker. The label had been removed, leaving only the ghost of glue and 4 small nail holes where it had once been attached. She tried the handle. Locked. She went through the key ring the auctioneer had given her, trying each one, feeling increasingly frustrated as none of them fit. The older keys, the ones that looked handmade, remained. She selected the largest and tried it. The lock resisted, then suddenly gave way with a click that echoed down the hallway. The door swung open slowly, revealing darkness so complete that her phone's flashlight seemed to die a few feet beyond the threshold. She stepped inside carefully, sweeping the light across the space. It was larger than the other rooms, much larger, and unlike them, it was not lined with shelves. Instead, filing cabinets stood in rows, dozens of them, each drawer labeled with years, 1955 to 1958, 1959 to 1962. The labels continued, marking decades, until they reached the present. Sarah approached the nearest cabinet and pulled open a drawer. Inside were photographs, thousands of them, organized in hanging files, each file labeled with a name and date. She pulled one out at random. A portrait of a woman in her 30s, her hair styled in the fashion of the 1960 seconds, her expression serious but not unkind. The print quality was exceptional, professional, the kind of work that belonged in a gallery, not in a drawer in a basement. She pulled out another file, a family portrait. Mother, father, 3 children arranged on a couch that placed the photo sometime in the 1970 seconds. The same quality, the same care in lighting and composition. She went to another cabinet, another decade. The pattern continued. Thousands of portraits, all meticulously preserved, all filed with a precision that suggested they mattered deeply to whoever had taken them. But something about them unsettled her. She couldn't identify it at first. The photographs were well made. The subjects looked natural. The compositions were balanced. Yet as she moved from cabinet to cabinet, drawer to drawer, the feeling grew stronger. There was something in the eyes of the subjects, something uniform, a distance, an awareness. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Portraits from different eras always looked strange to modern eyes. People didn't smile the same way. They didn't pose the same way. The formality of the process made everyone look serious. That was all this was. She was about to leave when she noticed the photographs on the wall. Unlike the ones upstairs, these were not framed. They were pinned directly to the plaster, arranged in a grid so precise it looked like graph paper. She approached slowly, her flashlight beam moving across them, and felt her skin prickle. They were all of the same person. A man, photographed, at different ages, in different decades. As a young man, in what looked like the 1950 seconds, middle-aged in the 70 seconds, elderly in the 90 seconds. But the backgrounds were wrong. In one photo he stood in front of the building, the sign behind him clear and new. In another, he was inside the studio, surrounded by cameras. In a third, he stood in this very room, facing the camera with an expression that was neither welcoming nor hostile, just present. Sarah counted them. 27 photographs spanning roughly 60 years, all of the same man, all taken in or around the building. She studied his face, trying to find something that explained the collection, the care, the obsessive preservation. His expression never changed much. He looked at the camera the way someone looks at a mirror, evaluating, assessing, aware of what he was seeing. The last photograph in the series was different. It showed the man much older, his hair white, his face deeply lined. He stood in the same basement room, surrounded by the filing cabinets, but he was not alone. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows, were shapes, human shapes, dozens of them, standing in the darkness as if waiting. Sarah's phone buzzed in her hand, breaking the moment. Mrs. Chen again, more insistent now. Emma wanted her mother home. It was getting late. She took one last look at the photographs, promising herself she would return tomorrow with better lighting, with more time to understand what she was seeing. She closed the door, locked it, and climbed the stairs back to ground level. Outside, the evening had arrived without her noticing. The street was empty, the other buildings dark. She locked the front door and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking up at the structure that now belonged to her. 3 stories of brick and mystery and value she was only beginning to understand. The windows reflected the last of the daylight, and for just a moment she thought she saw movement behind the glass, a shadow passing across one of the upper floors. She blinked, and it was gone. Exhaustion, she told herself. Stress, the emotional weight of the day, catching up with her. She walked to her car, got in, and drove home to Emma, already planning her return, already thinking about how to catalog everything, how to contact buyers, how to turn a gamble into security. The photographs on the basement wall stayed with her, though, the man's face, the shapes behind him, the feeling that she had not been alone down there, even when she clearly was. At home, Emma greeted her with a drawing of a cat wearing a crown. Sarah praised it, helped with homework, made dinner from what they had left in the cupboard. She did not mention the building. Not yet. Not until she understood what she had really bought. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began researching. She searched for Hartley's Camera Emporium, for the building's address, for anything that might explain the collection and the man in the photographs. The results were sparse. A few historical society mentions of the studio operating from 1952 to 2018, a period of 66 years. A single obituary from 6 years ago for Harrison Hartley, aged 94, survived by no immediate family, remembered for his contributions to the local photography community. No other details. No explanation for why the collection had been left to molder, why no one had claimed it, why it had ended up at auction with no reserve and no interested parties. She found collector forums and posted questions, describing the collection without revealing where it was or how much she had paid. The responses came quickly. If what she described was accurate, she was sitting on somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000 worth of vintage cameras, possibly more if the high-end pieces were in working condition. People offered to buy sight unseen. Others warned her about fakes. A few asked suspiciously detailed questions about provenance. Sarah closed the laptop and stared at the number. $400,000. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the kind of number that belonged to other people's lives. She thought of Emma's shoes, of the eviction notice, of the 3 months she had spent applying to jobs that never responded. $400,000 would erase all of that. It would rebuild everything that had crumbled. It would let her sleep without waking at 3 in the morning, heart racing, mentally calculating which bills could be delayed another week. She should have felt relief. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt the strange weight of the basement room, of the photographs on the wall, of the man's face repeating across 60 years. She told herself it didn't matter. Whatever his story was, it had ended 6 years ago. The cameras were here. She had bought them legally. What she chose to do with them was her decision. Sleep came slowly that night, and when it did, her dreams were dark and red, lit by a safe light that never quite illuminated what moved in the corners. The next morning, she returned to the building with a better flashlight, a notebook, and a determination to be systematic. She had made a plan during the night. Document everything first. Photograph each camera, note its condition, cross-reference with collector price guides. Then contact specialized auction houses, get proper valuations, find the right buyers. This was a business transaction now. There was no room for superstition or unease. The key turned easier this time, as if the lock had accepted her ownership. Inside, the dust had settled overnight, and the shafts of morning light cut through the space with slightly more warmth than they had the day before. She went straight to the basement, to the room with the camera collection, and began her work. She started with the oldest pieces, handling each one carefully, noting serial numbers and any visible damage. Most were in remarkable condition. The glass was clear. The mechanisms moved smoothly. Someone had maintained these cameras even after they became obsolete, had kept them functioning not for use, but for preservation. It was the work of a curator, not a photographer. By noon, she had documented 50 cameras, and her estimate was holding. If anything, she had been conservative. Several of the pieces were rarer than she had initially realized. A Leica 3 from 1933, nearly pristine. A Rolleiflex 2, 8F, with a Zeiss lens that commanded premium prices. A speed graphic that still had its original flash attachment. She took photographs of everything, uploaded them to a secure folder, and allowed herself a moment to feel the full weight of relief. This was real. This was happening. Emma would have new shoes. They would have food that wasn't chosen based on cost alone. The phone could ring without her stomach dropping. She could answer doors without fearing eviction officers. She was so focused on documenting the collection that she didn't notice how much time had passed. The light in the basement never changed much, artificially frozen in the fluorescent glow, and her phone had died an hour ago. When she finally climbed back upstairs to check the time on her car's dashboard, she was startled to see that it was nearly 5 in the afternoon. Mrs. Chen would be wondering where she was. Emma would be home from school. She locked up quickly, made a mental note to bring a phone charger tomorrow, and drove home faster than she should have, her mind already rehearsing how to explain where she had been, how to share just enough to excite Emma without overwhelming her with details that weren't certain yet. That night, after Emma was in bed, Sarah returned to her laptop and began reaching out to auction houses that specialized in vintage cameras. She wrote careful emails, attaching photographs, asking for preliminary assessments. She was honest about her lack of expertise, which several responses the next morning praised. Most people come to us thinking they have treasures and get upset when the truth is less dramatic. One appraiser wrote, "Your collection, however, is exceptional. We would be very interested in consigning several of these pieces." The estimates they gave were in line with what she had researched, sometimes higher. By the end of the week, she had 3 auction houses competing for her business, each one offering better terms, lower commission rates, guarantees of serious bidder outreach. The most aggressive offered to send a specialist to evaluate the entire collection in person. No obligation, no fee. Sarah accepted the offer and spent the weekend cleaning the building, or at least the parts she would allow the specialist to see. She focused on the camera room, organizing the pieces she had documented, making the space presentable. She did not touch the locked room at the end of the hall. She told herself it was because she didn't have time, because the photographs inside were not part of the collection she was selling. The truth was simpler. She didn't want to go back in there. The specialist arrived on Monday morning. His name was Thomas Brennan, and he greeted her with the kind of enthusiasm that only a true collector could muster. Within minutes of entering the basement room, he was moving from camera to camera with reverent speed, picking them up with practiced care, examining them with a jeweler's loupe he produced from his pocket. "This is remarkable," he said, not looking at her, his attention fixed on a Nikon F he had just discovered. "The condition, the breadth of the collection. Do you know who assembled this?" Sarah told him what little she knew. Harrison Hartley, a photographer who ran a portrait studio in the building for 66 years. No family, no heirs. The collection left to accumulate until it was auctioned for taxes. Thomas looked up from the camera, his expression troubled. "Hartley," he repeated. "I've heard that name. Not in collecting circles, but somewhere else." He paused, thinking, then shook his head. "It'll come to me. In the meantime, let's talk numbers." They spent the next 2 hours going through the collection, piece by piece. Thomas made notes in a leather journal, occasionally taking photographs with his phone, his excitement never dimming. When they finished, he closed the journal and looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed professional composure with genuine surprise. "I can give you a formal appraisal in writing within a week," he said, "but informally, if you can sign this collection to our next major auction, I believe you're looking at somewhere between $350,000 and $450,000, possibly more if we get competitive bidding on the rarer pieces." He paused. "Miss, Chen mentioned you were concerned about the basement. If you'd like, I can take a look at the storage areas down here as well. Sometimes darkroom equipment has value too, especially to institutional buyers." Sarah hesitated, then agreed. She led him down the hallway, showing him the storage room, the darkroom, the chemical prep area. He took notes, more out of professional thoroughness than excitement, occasionally commenting on a piece of equipment that might appeal to museum collections. When they reached the last door, the one she had not opened since her first visit, Sarah slowed. "What's in here?" Thomas asked. "More storage?" She unlocked the door, letting him enter first. The filing cabinets waited in their rows, the photographs on the wall barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. Thomas moved inside, turning on his phone's flashlight, and approached the nearest cabinet. "Portraits," he said, pulling open a drawer. Thousands of them. He began examining them with the same care he had given the cameras, pulling files at random, studying the prints. His enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "Quality work," he said, "but the market for vintage portraits isn't what it used to be. Unless there are notable subjects." He trailed off, opening another drawer, then another, his movements becoming faster, more purposeful. Sarah watched him from the doorway. "What is it?" she asked. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He went to the wall, studying the grid of photographs showing Harrison Hartley at different ages. He examined them for a long moment, then turned to Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Did you notice," he said carefully, "that these aren't the only photographs on this wall?" He angled his flashlight toward the corners of the room, where Sarah's light had not reached during her first visit. More photographs covered those walls, hundreds of them, arranged with the same precision. But these were not portraits. They were snapshots, candid images of people on the street, in their homes, through windows. Sarah stepped into the room, her unease returning. Thomas continued, "And did you notice the dates?" He pointed to the filing cabinet labels. "The collection goes to 6 years ago." "Right. But look at the dates on these newer portraits." He pulled open a drawer near the end of one cabinet. The files inside were labeled with dates from the past 5 years. Some were less than 6 months old. Sarah's mouth went dry. "That's not possible," she said. "The obituary said he died 6 years ago." Thomas closed the drawer slowly. I remember where I heard the name now, he said, his voice quieter. There was an article, about 10 years ago. Some concerns raised by a journalist about a local photographer who had an unusually extensive archive of subjects. Nothing illegal was ever proven, but there were questions about consent, about surveillance. The article was vague, mostly because no one wanted to accuse a respected community figure without evidence. But the name was Hartley. Harrison Hartley. Sarah felt cold. You think he was photographing people without them knowing? Thomas hesitated. I think he was photographing everyone, he said, for decades. And I think someone continued after he died. Or, he paused, looking again at the wall of photographs. Or something else is going on here that I don't understand. They stood in silence, the weight of the room pressing down on them. Sarah thought of the shapes in the last photograph, the shadows that looked like people waiting. She thought of the movement she had imagined in the windows on her first night. She thought of how the basement felt when she was alone, as if it were holding its breath. I need to lock this room, she said finally. I need to think. Thomas nodded, relieved. They left together, closing the door, turning the key. Upstairs, in the relative safety of daylight filtering through dusty windows, they concluded their business. Thomas promised the formal appraisal by the end of the week. He would handle the consignment paperwork. The auction would be scheduled for 6 weeks out, giving them time to market the collection properly. As he was leaving, he stopped at the door and turned back. Miss Chen, he said, I'm not superstitious, but I've been in this business 20 years, and I've handled some strange collections. If you feel uncomfortable here, if anything seems off, trust that instinct. The cameras are valuable. They'll sell regardless of where they're stored. You don't have to stay in this building. Sarah thanked him and watched him drive away. She locked the front door and stood alone in the reception area, surrounded by the portraits of people long dead, their serious faces tracking her movement. The building felt different now that she knew what was in its basement, what might still be in its basement. She should leave. She should take Thomas's advice, arrange for the cameras to be stored elsewhere, handle the sale at arm's length. But leaving meant abandoning whatever else might be hidden here. Leaving meant questions she would never answer. And more practically, leaving meant paying for storage she couldn't afford, meant exposing the collection to risks she couldn't control. She had bought this building. Whatever it contained, whatever it had been used for, was now her responsibility. She could walk away, or she could understand what she had walked into. She chose understanding, even as every instinct screamed that understanding might be exactly what she should avoid. The afternoon wore on. Sarah explored the upper floors she had not yet visited, climbing the stairs to the second level. It opened into a large studio space with tall windows along one wall, their glass so dirty the light that filtered through looked green and thin. Equipment stood in corners, tripods and light stands and backdrops rolled into cylinders and propped against walls. Everything was covered in dust, so thick it looked like snow, untouched for years. In the center of the room stood a single chair, positioned precisely in the spot where the light from the windows converged. The chair faced a camera on a tripod, one of the large format view cameras that required film sheets and patience. Sarah approached it carefully, as if it might spring to life at her presence. The camera was loaded. She could see the holder still inserted in the back. Whoever had set this up had intended to take a photograph and then stopped, leaving everything in place. She looked at the chair, at the camera, at the way the light fell across the floor in long, dusty beams. This was where the portraits had been taken. This was where hundreds, maybe thousands of people had sat and looked into the lens while Harrison Hartley immortalized them in silver and gelatin. The thought should have been benign, the ordinary work of a small-town photographer, but it felt wrong. The attention to detail, the perfect positioning, the camera still loaded and waiting. She backed away from the setup and continued exploring. The third floor held living quarters, a small bedroom with a narrow bed, neatly made, undisturbed for years, a kitchenette with a sink and hot plate, a bathroom so small she could barely turn around. This had been where Hartley lived, she realized, not in a house somewhere else. He had lived above his studio, surrounded by his work, never leaving. In the bedroom, a nightstand held a stack of journals matching the one she had found in the basement. She opened the top one. More logs, more entries, documenting camera acquisitions. But interspersed among them were other notes, written in the same careful hand, but with a different purpose. Observations about light, theories about preservation, long meditations on the relationship between photographer and subject, on what was captured and what was lost in the process of making an image permanent. The entries grew stranger near the end. The subjects never change, one read. Their faces age in the files, but in the moment of capture, they are frozen, forever present, forever aware. I believe they know. I believe they're still there, waiting behind the paper, watching for someone to see them. Another entry, dated months later. I've stopped taking new portraits. The collection is complete. Now I only maintain what exists. The developing, the printing, the filing. They need to be remembered. They need to be kept. Sarah closed the journal and set it down with shaking hands. The unease she had been fighting crystallized into something harder to dismiss. Harrison Hartley had not simply been a photographer with an extensive archive. He had been obsessed, convinced that his subjects existed somehow within their images, that his role was not just documentation, but preservation of something more than paper and chemistry. She left the living quarters and descended back to the ground floor, her mind racing. The cameras were valuable. The sale would proceed. But the building, the archive, the locked room full of portraits that supposedly stopped 6 years ago but didn't, all of that required decisions she was not equipped to make. She needed to talk to someone. Someone who understood photographs not just as collectibles, but as objects with history and weight. Outside, the evening had arrived again. The street was empty as always. Sarah locked the door and walked to her car, feeling exposed in a way she hadn't the previous days. As she reached for the handle, she heard something behind her. Not loud, just a soft metallic click, the sound of a lock turning. She turned slowly. The front door of the building stood slightly ajar, not swinging open, just unsealed, as if the latch had not quite caught. Sarah was certain she had locked it. She had tested the handle. She had heard the lock engage. She stood frozen, staring at the narrow gap between the door and the frame, at the darkness visible beyond it. Everything in her screamed to get in the car and drive away. Instead, she walked back to the building, pushed the door fully open, and looked inside. The reception area was exactly as she had left it. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. The portraits on the walls stared with their usual intensity. She closed the door firmly, locked it again, tested the handle twice. It held. She returned to her car, started the engine, and sat for a moment before driving, trying to calm her racing heart. It was an old building, old locks stuck, old doors settled. There was nothing supernatural about a door that didn't latch properly the first time. She repeated this to herself during the drive home, and by the time she pulled into her apartment complex, she almost believed it. Emma greeted her with news about a field trip, a permission slip that needed signing, excitement that couldn't be contained. Sarah listened, signed the form, made dinner, and did everything a mother should do while her mind remained miles away, in a basement room, staring at photographs that seemed to look back. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at her laptop and did something she had been avoiding. She searched for the article Thomas had mentioned, about concerns raised regarding Harrison Hartley's photography practices. It took time to find. The article had been published in a small weekly newspaper that had since closed. The archives were poorly maintained, but eventually she located it through a university library database. The article was brief and carefully worded, aware of the legal implications of accusing a local business owner without proof. It described anonymous complaints from former portrait subjects who claimed Hartley had kept and displayed their images without permission, that he had photographed them in contexts they didn't remember agreeing to, that they had felt watched in their daily lives by someone with a camera they never saw. The journalist had visited the studio, interviewed Hartley, described him as courteous but evasive, a man who spoke passionately about the importance of preserving moments, but seemed unable to explain the volume of his archive or the sources of many images that were clearly not formal portraits. The piece ended with a non-conclusion, noting that no laws had been clearly broken, that privacy standards were different decades ago when many of the photos were taken, and that Hartley had promised to be more transparent about his practices going forward. The date of the article was 8 years ago. Hartley had died 2 years later. Sarah closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the building creak around her, to the distant sound of traffic, to Emma's soft breathing from the next room. She thought about the portraits, about candid images of people who might not have known they were being photographed. She thought about the archive continuing past Hartley's death, which meant either the dates were wrong, or someone else had access to the building, or something impossible was happening. Tomorrow, she decided, she would call the authorities, not to report a crime, exactly, but to ask questions, to understand whether there were missing person reports that corresponded to subjects in the archive, to see if anyone else had expressed concerns, to do what responsible ownership required. Tonight, she would sleep, or try to, and in the morning, she would begin to untangle this properly. But sleep didn't come easily. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and at some point past midnight, she drifted off into dreams that felt more like memories. Dreams of a dark room lit by red light. Dreams of faces emerging from chemical baths, their eyes opening as the image became clear. Dreams of walking through the filing cabinets, pulling drawer after drawer, finding her own face repeated hundreds of times across decades she hadn't lived yet. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, and reached for her phone to check the time. 3:15 in the morning. Emma was still sleeping peacefully. The apartment was quiet. Everything was normal. Yet the dream clung to her, vivid and immediate, and as she lay there trying to calm herself, she realized something that made her skin prickle. She had never been in a darkroom while a photograph developed. She didn't know what it looked like when a face emerged from the chemical bath. Yet, in her dream, the process had been perfect, detailed, exactly right, as if she had watched it happen, as if she had been there, standing in the red glow, waiting for the image to appear. Morning came too early, pulling Sarah from sleep that had been shallow and troubled. Emma's alarm chirped from the next room, and the familiar routine began. Breakfast. Backpack. Check. The walk to school through streets that looked ordinary and felt wrong, as if the night had changed something fundamental that only Sarah could sense. She dropped Emma at the entrance, watched her disappear into the building, and felt the weight of decision pressed down on her shoulders. She could go to work, except she didn't have work. She could go home, except home was questions without answers, and bills she couldn't pay yet. Or she could return to the building and do what needed to be done. Document everything. Understand what she had bought. Make the practical choices that would secure Emma's future. The building waited exactly as she had left it, its brick facade absorbing the morning light without warmth. Sarah unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately noticed something different. The smell. Yesterday it had been dust and chemicals and age. Today there was something else beneath it. Sharp. Acidic. The scent of darkroom chemicals being actively used. She stood very still in the reception area, listening. The building was silent except for the settling sounds old structures make, the small creaks and groans that meant nothing or everything depending on your state of mind. She checked her phone. 8:40 in the morning. The auction had been 10 days ago. No one else had keys. No one else should be here. She moved through the ground floor systematically, checking the studio space, the office areas, looking for signs of disturbance. Everything appeared untouched. The dust lay thick and undisturbed, except for her own footprints from previous visits. Yet the chemical smell grew stronger as she descended the stairs to the basement, until by the time she reached the bottom, it was unmistakable. Someone had been developing photographs. The hallway stretched before her, doors closed as she had left them. She tried each one. Locked. Locked. The storage room opened. Unchanged. The darkroom door resisted, then gave. Inside, the space was exactly as it had been during her first visit. Developing trays dry and empty, enlarger covered in dust. The red safe light bulb hanging dark and still. Nothing had been disturbed. Yet the chemical smell was strongest here. Sarah moved to the sink and ran her fingers along its edge. Dry. She checked the floor for water spots, for any sign of recent use. Nothing. The chemicals on the shelves were sealed, their caps undisturbed by fingerprints in the dust that covered everything. She was about to leave when she noticed the drain. A faint wetness around its edge, barely visible, as if water had been poured down it recently and the residue had not fully dried. She knelt and smelled it. Acetic acid. Stop, bath. The same chemical photographers used to halt the developing process. Someone had been here. Someone had used this darkroom. But there was no evidence except the smell and the faint dampness around a drain that should have been dry for years. Sarah stood and backed out of the room, her unease crystallizing into something closer to fear. She thought of the locked door at the end of the hall, of the portraits that continued past Hartley's death, of the photograph on the wall showing shapes in the shadows. She thought of her dream, of faces emerging from chemical baths, with their eyes opening. She told herself to leave, to call someone, to not be alone here. Instead, she walked to the locked door and opened it. The filing cabinets waited in their precise rows, exactly as she and Thomas had left them. The photographs on the wall showed Harrison Hartley at different ages, still staring with that evaluating expression. Sarah moved deeper into the room, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, and approached the cabinets that held the most recent portraits. She opened the drawer labeled with dates from the past year. Inside were files, each one containing portraits she had seen before. But today, in better light, with her attention focused, she noticed something she had missed. The backgrounds in these recent photographs were not generic studio settings. They were specific locations. A kitchen with distinctive tile work, a living room with a particular wallpaper pattern, a bedroom with a window that showed a street view she almost recognized. She pulled out another file, another portrait, another specific background. She went through a dozen files, her hands moving faster, her breath coming shorter, and then she saw one that stopped her completely. The portrait showed a woman in her 30s, standing in a kitchen. The tile work was green and white in a checkerboard pattern. The window behind her showed a parking lot and a dumpster. Sarah knew that kitchen. She knew that window. It was Mrs. Chen's apartment, the one directly below hers. The photograph was dated 3 months ago. The woman in it was Mrs. Chen. Sarah's hands shook as she pulled out more files, more portraits of people she recognized. Her mailman, the clerk at the grocery store, the woman who ran the laundromat, all photographed in their homes, in private spaces, within the past year, all taken after Harrison Hartley had died. She backed away from the cabinet, her mind racing. Someone had continued his work. Someone had access to this building, to this dark room, to these files. Someone was photographing people without their knowledge and storing the images here, maintaining an archive that Hartley had started decades ago. The realization made her skin crawl. This wasn't just a collection of vintage cameras and forgotten portraits. This was active. This was ongoing. This was surveillance disguised as art. She needed to call the police. She needed to document this properly, to let authorities handle whatever was happening here. But first, she needed to understand the scope. She needed to know how deep this went. She moved along the filing cabinets, opening drawers at random, and found the same pattern. Recent portraits mixed with old ones. People photographed in their homes, at work, in moments of privacy they believed were unobserved. Then she reached the last cabinet, the one in the far corner of the room. Its drawers were labeled differently. Not with dates, but with a single word repeated, special. She pulled open the top drawer and found it empty, except for a single file folder. The label read, Process. Inside were technical notes written in Hartley's careful handwriting, instructions for a photographic process she had never heard of. It involved chemicals she couldn't identify, exposure times that seemed impossibly long, and developing procedures that required multiple baths in solutions that had to be prepared in a specific order. The notes were precise, scientific, yet they referenced results that made no sense. Subject awareness increased with each exposure. Image persistence, beyond substrate, confirmed. Interaction, documented in trial, 47. Sarah read the notes twice, trying to make sense of them, and failed completely. The language was technical, but the concepts were impossible. Photographs didn't create awareness. Images didn't persist beyond the paper they were printed on. Yet Hartley had documented these results as if they were reproducible facts, and someone who came after him believed enough to continue the work. She replaced the file and moved to the next drawer. This one held negatives, large format sheets in protective sleeves, each one labeled with a date and a single word, contact. She held one up to her flashlight, trying to see the image, but the negative was so dense, so dark, that no light passed through it. She tried another, then a third. All of them were opaque, as if they had been overexposed to the point where no image could exist. Yet they were carefully filed, carefully preserved, as if they held something valuable. The third drawer contained prints. Sarah pulled one out and studied it in the beam of her flashlight. At first, it looked blank, just gray photographic paper with no visible image. But as she tilted it, catching the light at different angles, she began to see something. Not a photograph in the traditional sense, but a pattern, shadows within shadows, shapes that suggested faces without quite forming them. She pulled out another print. The same effect. A presence without a clear image. A sensation of being looked at without being able to see who was looking. She went through the drawer, print after print, showing the same impossible quality, and felt her rational understanding of photography collapse. These were not failed experiments. They were intentional results of a process that should not work. The fourth drawer held journals, not ledgers or logs, but personal writings. Sarah opened the first one and began to read. The entries started normally enough, discussing techniques, frustrations with exposure times, notes about difficult subjects. But halfway through, the tone changed. Hartley wrote about discovering that photographs were not just records but connections, that the act of capturing an image created a link between photographer and subject that persisted beyond the moment of exposure. He wrote about experiments where subjects reported dreaming about being photographed days after their portraits were taken, about sensing being watched when they were alone, about seeing his face in reflections that shouldn't contain it. He documented these effects with the detachment of a scientist, recording variables, adjusting his process, refining the technique that created these connections. The later entries grew more ambitious. He wrote about permanence, about finding a way to preserve not just appearances, but presence. He theorized that if the chemical process was precise enough, if the exposure was long enough, if the subject was aware enough during capture, then something essential could be transferred from person to paper. Not a soul, he was careful to clarify, but an awareness, a point of view, a consciousness that existed in the image itself. Sarah closed the journal and set it down carefully, as if it might contaminate her if she held it too long. She understood now what she had walked into. Harrison Hartley had not been a photographer documenting people. He had been conducting experiments in something that had no name, using techniques that shouldn't work, pursuing results that defied everything known about how photography functioned. And someone, somewhere, had learned his methods and continued them. She needed to leave this room. She needed to seal it, to lock it, to make sure no one could access these files until proper authorities could investigate. But as she turned toward the door, her flashlight swept across the photographs on the wall, and she saw something that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been visible, or hadn't existed until this moment. The last photograph in the series, the one showing Harrison Hartley surrounded by shapes in the darkness, had changed. The shapes were clearer now, more defined. They were people, dozens of them, standing in the background, their faces visible, their eyes open, and Sarah recognized them. They were the subjects from the portraits, the people from the files, all of them together, standing behind Hartley, watching him watch the camera. Her breath caught. She backed away from the wall, her flashlight beam shaking, and that's when she noticed the other photographs. The ones in the darkest corners of the room that she had not examined closely before. They showed this room, this exact room, taken from different angles, at different times, documenting its contents. But in each one, standing among the filing cabinets, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure, sometimes alone, sometimes surrounded by others, sometimes facing the camera, sometimes turned away. Sarah forced herself to approach the nearest photograph. She held her flashlight steady and looked at the figure in the shadows. The resolution was poor, the lighting bad, but the shape was unmistakable. It was her, wearing the clothes she had worn yesterday, standing in a position she had stood in when she and Thomas explored the room. The photograph was dated 2 days ago. She turned and ran, up the stairs, through the reception area, out the front door, into sunlight that felt thin and insufficient. She stood on the sidewalk, gulping air, trying to calm the panic that had seized her chest. Someone had been in that room while she was in that room. Someone had photographed her without her seeing them, without her hearing them, without leaving any evidence of their presence except an image that should not exist. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. The operator answered with professional calm, asking about her emergency. Sarah tried to explain. Building she owned, unauthorized photographs, evidence of surveillance, her own image documented without consent. The words came out jumbled, barely coherent, and she could hear the operator's confusion growing. "Ma'am, are you in immediate danger?" the operator asked. Sarah looked back at the building, at the windows that reflected nothing but sky, at the door she had left open in her panic. "I don't know," she said honestly. The operator asked her location, told her to stay on the line, said officers would be dispatched. Sarah waited on the sidewalk, phone pressed to her ear, watching the building for movement. that never came. 2 patrol cars arrived within 10 minutes. Sarah explained again, more calmly now, walking the officers through what she had found. The vintage camera collection, valuable and legitimate. The portrait archive, extensive and disturbing. The recent photographs, impossible but real. The image of herself that should not exist. The officers listened with expressions that shifted from professional attention to barely concealed skepticism. "Let's take a look," the older officer said, and Sarah led them inside. Down to the basement, down the hallway. To the locked door she unlocked and pushed open. The filing cabinets waited in their rows. The photographs covered the walls. Everything was exactly as it had been minutes before. The officers examined the space methodically. They opened drawers, looked through files, studied the photographs on the walls. One of them took pictures with his phone, documenting the scene. The other asked Sarah questions about the building's history, about how long she had owned it, about whether anyone else had keys. She answered as clearly as she could, feeling the weight of their doubt growing with each response. "These portraits," the younger officer said, holding up a file. "You said some were taken after the original owner died. How do you know?" Sarah showed them the dates on the labels, explained about Harrison Hartley's obituary, about the 6-year gap. The officer nodded, but his expression suggested he was not convinced. Dates on file folders constituted proof of anything. "And this photograph of you," the older officer said, examining the image Sarah had seen. "You're certain you didn't know it was being taken?" Sarah wanted to scream. How could she have known? Who could have taken it? But she kept her voice level and explained again. She had been alone. The room had been locked. There was no camera visible, no tripod, no evidence of anyone else present. The officers exchanged glances that communicated something Sarah couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or the decision that this was not a situation requiring immediate action. "We'll file a report," the older officer said carefully. "We'll note the contents of the room, the photographs, your concerns about surveillance. We can have a detective follow-up, talk to you about the building's history, maybe reach out to the previous owner's estate, if there is one." It was a polite dismissal. Sarah recognized it immediately. They did not believe her. Or, more precisely, they believed something, but not what she needed them to believe. They saw a woman who had bought a strange property and discovered strange contents, and was reacting with understandable unease, but not legitimate alarm. They saw photographs that could have been taken at any time, labeled with dates that could have been applied by anyone. They saw a room that was creepy, but not criminal. After they left, Sarah stood alone in the basement hallway and felt the full weight of isolation settle over her. No one was going to help her understand this. No one was going to investigate properly. She was alone with whatever was happening in this building, and the only choice she had was to continue or to walk away. The cameras were still valuable. The auction house was still interested. She could proceed with the sale, take her money, and never return to this place. Let whoever came after her deal with the portrait archive, and the locked room, and the impossible photographs. But walking away meant abandoning the question. It meant living with the knowledge that someone or something had photographed her without her awareness, had created an image that should not exist, had demonstrated capabilities that defied everything she understood about photography. It meant Emma growing up in a world where her mother had been too afraid to face what she had discovered. Sarah locked the basement room, climbed the stairs, and made a decision. She would continue. She would document everything properly. She would find experts who understood photography not just as a commercial art, but as a technical process. She would understand what Hartley had discovered, what methods he had used, whether his theories had any basis in reality, or whether she was simply looking at the obsessive delusions of an isolated man, preserved in paper and chemistry. She spent the rest of the day in the camera room, forcing herself to focus on the practical. She photographed each piece of equipment, cross-referenced serial numbers, prepared detailed documentation for the auction house. The work was methodical, grounding, a reminder that some things in this building were exactly what they appeared to be. Valuable cameras assembled by a collector. Nothing more. By evening, she had documented 3/4 of the collection, and her estimate had risen. Several pieces were rarer than she had initially thought. A compass camera from 1937, one of only a few thousand ever made. A Robot 2 Luftwaffe model that had been used by the German Air Force. These alone could bring 20 or 30,000 each. The collection's total value was approaching the high end of Thomas's estimate, possibly exceeding it. She locked up as the sun set, tested the door 3 times to ensure it caught properly, and drove home with her mind divided between relief at the camera's value and unease about everything else. Emma greeted her with a project that needed glitter and poster board, and Sarah helped with the grateful distraction of ordinary problems that had ordinary solutions. They worked together at the kitchen table, cutting and pasting, and for a few hours, Sarah forgot about darkrooms and impossible photographs and surveillance that crossed the boundary between life and death. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah returned to her laptop and began researching what she had found. She searched for experimental photographic processes, for techniques that claimed to capture more than light and shadow. She found mentions of spirit photography from the Victorian era, of double exposures used to fake supernatural images, of tricks and frauds that had been debunked decades ago. But she found nothing about processes that created awareness or persistence or connections between subject and image. She expanded her search, looking for academic papers on photography and consciousness, on whether images could contain anything beyond the chemical and physical record of light hitting film. She found philosophy about representation and reality, about how photographs shape memory and identity, but nothing that suggested Hartley's theories had any scientific basis. Everything she read told her that what he believed was impossible. Photographs were objects, images were reflections. The idea that they could contain awareness or create connections was delusion, not discovery. Yet the photographs existed. The recent ones, dated after Hartley's death. The image of her taken without her knowledge. These were facts, not theories. Someone was continuing his work. Someone believed in his methods enough to practice them. The question was not whether Hartley's theories were correct, but whether someone acting on those theories could create effects that felt real, that impacted people, that generated the kind of fear and unease Sarah now carried. She found her answer not in academic journals, but in a blog post written by a former portrait subject. The post was old, poorly formatted, abandoned after only 3 entries. But it described an experience that matched Sarah's growing understanding. The author had sat for a portrait at Hartley's studio 20 years earlier. A simple session, professional, unremarkable. But afterward, they had experienced what they described as persistent observation, the sense of being watched, dreams of being photographed, glimpses of Hartley's face in mirrors and windows. The author had returned to the studio to complain, to demand the negatives be destroyed. Hartley had refused, explaining that the portrait was his work, his property, his art. The author had left angry and disturbed, but over time the experiences had faded. The sense of being watched had diminished. The dreams had stopped. Life had returned to normal. Until recently, 6 months ago, the author wrote, the feelings had returned, stronger than before, as if someone had taken up where Hartley had left off. The blog ended there. No more entries. No update. Sarah searched for the author's name, found an obituary from 4 months ago. Car accident, single vehicle, no witnesses. The authorities had ruled it death by misadventure, driver error. But the timing unsettled Sarah. 6 months after the feelings returned. 4 months ago. Still within the range of dates on the recent portrait files in the locked room. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the building around her settle and creak. The cameras were valuable. The sale would proceed. But the portrait archive was dangerous. Not because it contained ghosts or supernatural forces, but because it documented decades of violation. Photographs taken without consent. Private moments captured and preserved. People who believed they were alone, who discovered too late that they were being watched, filed, made permanent in an archive that served no purpose except control. Whoever continued Hartley's work had access to his techniques and his files. They knew how to develop his special process. They had the chemicals, the equipment, the skill. And they had chosen to keep photographing people, adding to the archive, maintaining a collection that should have been destroyed when Hartley died. That person was still active, still working, still adding new portraits to drawers that would eventually run out of space. Sarah stood and checked the locks on her apartment door, the windows, the sliding door to the small balcony. She checked Emma's room, watching her daughter sleep with the peaceful certainty of childhood. Then she returned to the kitchen and made a decision. Tomorrow, she would go back to the building. Not to document the cameras or prepare for the auction, but to find the darkroom where the recent photographs had been developed. Because someone was using that space. Someone had left evidence. And if she could find where they worked, she might find who they were. Sleep came in fragments again. Sarah woke repeatedly, checked her phone, stared at the ceiling, and waited for morning. When it finally arrived, she felt exhausted but determined. She took Emma to school, kissed her goodbye, and drove to the building with a new sense of purpose. Whatever happened next, she would face it directly. She would not run from shadows. The building greeted her with its usual silence. Sarah unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately smelled the chemicals again. Stronger than yesterday. Recent. Someone had been here. Someone had been working. She descended to the basement quickly, moving with purpose rather than fear, and went straight to the darkroom. The door was unlocked. Inside, the room had changed. The developing trays that had been empty were now filled with liquid. The enlarger that had been covered in dust was clean, positioned over a baseboard that held photographic paper. The red safe light was on, casting everything in crimson that made the space feel like the inside of something alive. Sarah stepped inside carefully, her eyes adjusting to the dim red glow. On the drying rack, several prints hung from clips, still damp, their surfaces gleaming. She approached slowly and looked at them. Portraits, recent ones, people she didn't recognize, photographed in their homes, unaware. The quality was exceptional, the lighting perfect, the compositions careful. Whoever had taken these was skilled, patient, practiced. She heard something behind her, not loud, just a small sound, the whisper of fabric against fabric. She turned quickly, her heart slamming, and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Backlit by the hallway light, their features hidden in shadow, their posture calm and observant. They had been watching her. For how long, she couldn't know. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure didn't respond immediately. They stood there, silent and still, and Sarah felt the full weight of vulnerability crash over her. She was alone in a basement. No one knew she was here. Her phone was in her pocket, but calling for help meant turning away from the figure, meant losing sight of them, meant trusting they wouldn't move closer while she was distracted. "You shouldn't be here," the figure finally said. A man's voice. Not old, but not young either. Calm, matter of fact. As if Sarah were the intruder rather than him. This isn't your work. It's mine. Sarah's anger flared past her fear. This is my building, she said. You're trespassing. You're developing photographs without permission. You're surveillance. The figure stepped forward slightly, just enough that the red safe light caught his face. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and glasses that reflected the crimson glow. His expression was not threatening. It was curious, evaluating, the same expression Harrison Hartley wore in his self-portraits. The building is yours, he acknowledged. The work is mine. It was Hartley's. He taught me. Before he died, he made me promise to continue, to keep the archive, to maintain the process. The process is illegal, Sarah said, her phone now in her hand, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, taking photographs of people without their knowledge, storing them. It's surveillance. It's stalking. You need to leave. Now. The man tilted his head slightly, considering her words. Hartley called it documentation, he said. Preservation. Everyone dies. Everyone is forgotten. But if they're photographed correctly, with the right process, they persist. They exist beyond their own awareness. The archive is their immortality. Sarah heard the conviction in his voice and recognized it immediately. This was not rational belief. This was obsession, passed from teacher to student, justified by technical skill and philosophical delusion. It doesn't matter what Hartley called it, she said. It's wrong. The portraits need to be destroyed. The archive needs to be shut down. And you need to leave my property. The man's expression changed. Not to anger, but to something sadder. You don't understand, he said quietly. The portraits can't be destroyed. The people in them, they exist there now. Not completely, not in a way most people would recognize, but they're present, watching, waiting. If you destroy the images, you destroy them. A second death. Permanent. Final. He paused, then added, including yours. Sarah's blood went cold. What do you mean, including mine? The man gestured toward the filing cabinets in the next room. You're in the archive now, he said simply. 3 exposures so far. Each one deepens the connection. By the 5th, you'll notice. By the 10th, you'll understand. Hartley established the protocols. I'm following them. You're being preserved, just like everyone else. Sarah backed toward the door, her phone now raised, the emergency call screen active. Stay away from me, she said. Don't come near me again. Don't photograph me again. I'm calling the police. They'll arrest you. They'll shut this down. The man made no move toward her. He simply stood in the red light, watching her with that evaluating expression, and Sarah realized with a chill that he wasn't concerned about the police. He wasn't worried about arrest or consequences. He believed completely in what he was doing, and that belief made him more dangerous than any physical threat. She ran, up the stairs, through the building, out into sunlight that felt like salvation. She called 911 while standing on the sidewalk, told the operator there was an intruder in her building, someone engaged in illegal activity, someone who had threatened her. The operator asked if she was safe now, if the intruder was still inside. Sarah said yes, she was outside. Yes, he was in the basement. Please send officers immediately. They arrived within minutes. Sarah met them at the door and explained quickly. Man in the basement darkroom, developing photographs without permission, making threats. The officers drew their weapons, entered carefully, descended the stairs with practiced caution. Sarah waited outside, listening to the sounds of doors being opened, commands being shouted, silence stretching. After 10 minutes, the officers emerged, looking confused. "There's no one down there, ma'am," the older officer said. "We checked every room. The dark room, the storage spaces, the locked room you showed us yesterday. All empty." Sarah's stomach dropped. "That's impossible," she said. "He was there. In the dark room. We spoke. He told me he was continuing Hartley's work." The officers exchanged another glance. "The dark room shows signs of recent use," the younger one said carefully. "Developing trays filled with chemicals. Prints drying on racks. But no one was present when we entered. There's only one staircase, right? We would have seen someone leaving." Sarah nodded numbly. The building had one staircase, one exit from the basement. The man could not have passed her, could not have left while she was calling 911. Yet, he was gone. The officers suggested she wait outside while they conducted a more thorough search. Sarah agreed, grateful not to go back inside. She stood on the sidewalk, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the day, and tried to understand what had happened. The man had been real. She had seen him, heard him. He had spoken to her with conviction about processes and preservation, and her own presence in the archive. He could not have simply vanished, unless he knew the building better than she did, unless there were spaces she hadn't found, hidden areas, secret exits. The building was over 100 years old. It had housed a business for 66 years. It was entirely possible that it contained passages or rooms she had not discovered. The man could have slipped away through a route she didn't know existed, emerging elsewhere while the police searched the obvious spaces. Or, the darker part of her mind whispered, he had never been there at all. The stress, the lack of sleep, the disturbing photographs had created a hallucination, a manifestation of her fear given form and voice. She had imagined the conversation, imagined the man. The darkroom had been used, yes, but not while she was there, earlier, before she arrived. And the figure in the doorway had been shadow and light, and exhaustion shaping themselves into a person who wasn't real. The officers returned and confirmed no one was in the building. They had checked every room, every closet, every space large enough to hide a person. They had examined the darkroom, documented the evidence of recent use, taken photographs of the developing trays and the prints on the drying rack. They could file a report. They could treat it as an active investigation into trespassing and illegal surveillance. But without a suspect, without proof that anyone other than Sarah had been in the building recently, there was little they could do beyond suggest she change the locks and consider installing security cameras. After they left, Sarah sat in her car and tried to think clearly. She had two choices. She could accept that she had hallucinated the man in the darkroom, acknowledge that stress and fear had generated an experience that felt real but wasn't, seek help for the psychological strain she was clearly under. Or she could accept that the man was real, that he had escaped through means she didn't understand, that he was continuing Hartley's work and intended to continue photographing her regardless of her objections. Both options terrified her. Both suggested she was not in control. But one offered a path forward, and the other offered only continued mystery. She chose the path forward. She would change the locks. She would install cameras. She would document everything in the building that could be documented and sell everything that could be sold. She would remove the collection from this place and let it be dispersed, scattered, disconnected from whatever history had accumulated here. And she would seal the portrait archive, lock it, preserve it only long enough to ensure proper authorities could investigate. She started the car and drove to a hardware store, bought new locks and a battery-powered security camera system that promised easy installation. She returned to the building and spent the afternoon changing the locks on every door, interior and exterior. She installed cameras in the hallway, in the stairwell, in the basement corridor. She positioned them to cover the dark room door, the locked room, the camera collection. If anyone entered, she would know. If anything moved, she would have proof. By the time she finished, the light was fading, and her hands were sore from working with tools she barely knew how to use. But the building was secured, or as secured as she could make it. She tested the new locks multiple times, confirmed the cameras were recording to the cloud storage she had purchased, and left with a sense of having done what she could. The rest would wait for tomorrow. At home, Emma showed her a test she had aced, and Sarah praised her with enthusiasm that felt genuine despite the exhaustion beneath it. They made dinner together, talked about Emma's upcoming field trip, watched a movie that required no thought. Normal life continuing around the abnormality Sarah carried with her like a weight. That night, after Emma was asleep, Sarah checked the security camera feeds on her phone. The building looked empty and still. The hallways showed nothing but darkness and the faint glow of the camera's infrared LEDs. The darkroom door remained closed. The locked room, undisturbed. Everything as it should be. She set her phone to alert her if any motion was detected and tried to sleep. The alert came at 2:17 in the morning. Sarah woke instantly, her phone buzzing on the nightstand. The notification clear. Motion detected. Basement camera 2. She opened the app with shaking hands and watched the feed. The hallway camera showed a figure moving past, heading toward the darkroom. The image was grainy, distorted by infrared and low resolution, but the shape was unmistakably human. Not large, not small. Moving with purpose. The figure reached the darkroom door, opened it, and disappeared inside. Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as the timer on the feed continued. 5 minutes passed. 10. The figure did not emerge. She switched to the camera inside the darkroom. But that feed showed nothing. The camera had been repositioned, pointed at the wall, its view deliberately blocked. Someone had moved it. Someone was in there now, aware of the security system, unbothered by it. She called 911 again. Explained again. Intruder, security footage, happening right now. The operator dispatched officers, told her to stay where she was, not to approach the building. Sarah agreed but kept watching the feed. The hallway camera still showed nothing. The figure had entered and not left. By the time the officers arrived, 15 minutes had passed. They entered the building with weapons drawn, cleared the basement room by room, and found no one. The darkroom showed signs of continued use. More prints drying, more chemicals mixed. But the intruder was gone again. "Miss Chen," the older officer said when they emerged, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We've responded twice now to reports of intruders. Both times we found evidence someone's been working in that darkroom, but no one present when we arrive. The security footage you're showing us is too grainy to identify anyone. At this point, we need to consider whether you have a neighbor with legitimate access, whether the previous owner's estate maintains rights to the space, whether there's a legal explanation for what you're experiencing." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist this was criminal trespass, surveillance, stalking, but she heard the shift in his tone. They were beginning to see her as the problem. The woman who kept calling about intruders no one could find. The woman whose security cameras captured shapes but not proof. They would still respond if she called, but their belief in her claims was eroding with each empty basement. After they left, Sarah sat alone in the building's reception area and forced herself to think practically. The cameras were valuable. Thomas had sent the formal appraisal. The auction was scheduled for 5 weeks from now. She could move the cameras off-site, store them somewhere secure, remove them from this building entirely. That would accomplish the primary goal. The sale would proceed. Emma's future would be protected. Everything else could be someone else's problem. She spent the next 2 days arranging storage, renting a climate-controlled unit across town, and carefully packing the camera collection for transport. The work was tedious, requiring padding and labeling and care, but it kept her away from the basement, away from the darkroom, away from spaces where figures appeared and disappeared and left only evidence of having existed. On the 3rd day, with most of the cameras packed and ready to move, Sarah returned to the locked room one final time. She needed to document the portrait archive properly before sealing it permanently. She needed photographs that showed the scope of what existed here, evidence that would support an investigation if authorities ever took her concerns seriously. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and froze. The filing cabinets had been rearranged. Not dramatically, not enough that someone who didn't know the space would notice. But Sarah had spent hours here. She knew how the cabinets had been positioned. They were different now, moved slightly, rotated, as if someone had been accessing them from new angles, creating space that hadn't existed before. She approached the nearest cabinet and opened a drawer at random. The files were rearranged too, different order, different organization. Someone had been curating the archive. Someone had spent time here, moving through the portraits, reorganizing them according to logic Sarah couldn't decipher. She pulled out files, checking contents, and found photographs missing from some, added to others. The archive was not static. It was being actively maintained, edited, refined. She turned to the wall where Harrison Hartley's photographs hung in their precise grid. They looked the same at first glance, but as she studied them, she noticed differences. Small ones. New photographs had been added. Not many, perhaps 5 or 6, filling gaps she hadn't noticed before. The additions showed Hartley in places she hadn't seen in the original sequence, inside the darkroom, standing in this room among the filing cabinets. And in the last new image, standing exactly where Sarah stood now, facing the camera with that same evaluating expression. Behind him, in the photograph's background, was Sarah, not as she appeared now, but as she had appeared 3 days ago when she first entered this room with Thomas. The photograph showed her examining the filing cabinets, unaware she was being captured. The image was dated yesterday, the day she had been at home, the day she had not visited the building. Sarah's legs went weak. She sat down on the floor, her back against a filing cabinet, and tried to process what she was seeing. The photograph could not exist. She had not been in this room yesterday. Yet the image showed her here, in clothes she had worn 3 days ago, in a position she had occupied only once. Either the photograph was fabricated, digitally manipulated, and printed to look old, or time in this room did not work the way time worked elsewhere. She forced herself to stand, to examine the other new photographs. They showed the building at different times. Some images appeared historical, showing the studio as it had looked decades ago with different furniture, different equipment. Others were recent, showing spaces as they appeared now. But all of them contained something that didn't belong. A figure in the background, sometimes clear, sometimes barely visible, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups. And Sarah recognized them. They were the subjects from the portrait files, the people who had sat for Hartley's photographs, who had been documented and filed and preserved. They appeared in these new images as if they had never left, as if the act of being photographed had tied them to this place permanently, making them part of the building's history in a way that transcended their physical absence. Sarah took photographs of everything with her phone, the rearranged cabinets, the new images on the wall, the impossible photograph showing her in a room she hadn't visited. She documented angles and positions and details, creating a record that might convince someone, somewhere, that what she was reporting was real. Then she left the room, locked the door, and climbed the stairs with a clarity born from understanding. The building was not simply a location where strange things happened. It was the mechanism by which they happened. Hartley had not discovered a photographic process that captured awareness. He had discovered or created a place where photographs functioned differently, where images had weight, where the act of being captured on film created connections that persisted. The building itself was the camera. The darkroom was where it developed, and the portrait archive was its memory. Sarah emerged into afternoon light that felt artificial, too bright and too ordinary for what she now carried. She locked the front door and walked to her car, her mind already calculating next steps. The cameras would be moved as planned. The sale would proceed. But the building itself, the portrait archive, the darkroom where impossible things occurred that would require decisions beyond her capacity to make alone. She needed experts, not in cameras or photography, but in places, in buildings that accumulated history until they became something other than architecture. She drove home, picked up Emma from the neighbor's apartment, and spent the evening being present in ways that required conscious effort. Homework, dinner, bath time, the routines that anchored them both. And when Emma was finally asleep, Sarah returned to her laptop and began searching for people who studied places where normal rules seemed not to apply. She found academics who specialized in folklore and urban legend, investigators who examined reports of unusual phenomena, researchers who approached the supposedly supernatural with scientific skepticism but genuine curiosity. She composed emails carefully, describing the building without sensationalism, the portrait archive, the darkroom, the photographs that suggested continuity past death, the figure who appeared and disappeared, the security footage. She attached images, offered access, asked for help understanding what existed in the space she now owned. She sent the emails, knowing most would go unanswered, that serious academics avoided anything that smelled of ghost stories or conspiracy. But she needed only one response. One person willing to examine the evidence without immediate dismissal. The response came from Dr. Elena Voss, an anthropologist who specialized in material culture and the social history of photography. Her email was brief, but promising. Your description matches patterns I've encountered in other cases of obsessive archival practices. I'm interested in examining the space and its contents. I have a graduate student completing a thesis on Victorian spirit photography who might benefit from seeing your collection as well. Would next week work for a preliminary visit? Sarah replied immediately, accepting the offer, providing the building's address, explaining the security situation, and her concerns about the intruder. Dr. Voss responded within hours, acknowledging the concerns and promising to bring proper documentation equipment. Whatever is happening in your building, she wrote, it deserves serious examination rather than dismissal. I'll bring measuring equipment, chemical testing supplies, and an open mind. Between the three of us, we should be able to determine whether you're dealing with continued trespassing or something more unusual. The week passed slowly. Sarah continued moving cameras to secure storage, packing and transporting load after load until the basement room stood empty, except for the furniture and equipment too heavy to move alone. She checked the security cameras constantly, watching for the figure that appeared at irregular intervals, always heading to the darkroom, always disappearing before authorities arrived. She documented every appearance, every timestamp, building a record that showed pattern rather than randomness. On the day Dr. Voss was scheduled to arrive, Sarah woke early and returned to the building one more time before their meeting. She wanted to see it in the morning light, wanted to experience it without the weight of evening shadows. The building greeted her with the same silence it always had, but something felt different, changed. She couldn't identify the alteration at first. Then she realized the portrait photographs in the reception area had been straightened. All of them. They hung perfectly level now, arranged with geometric precision, as if someone had spent hours making sure each frame aligned exactly. Sarah had not touched them. She had not straightened a single photograph since she bought the building. Yet there they were, perfect and deliberate, creating a gallery that felt curated rather than abandoned. She walked among them slowly, examining faces that stared back with their usual intensity, and realized something else had changed. The dust, the thick layer of dust that had covered everything was lighter now. Not gone, but reduced, as if someone had been cleaning carefully, preserving rather than erasing the passage of time. She descended to the basement and found the same pattern. The hallway floor, which had shown only her footprints and the officer's boot marks, now showed evidence of careful sweeping. The darkroom door, which had been marked with fingerprints in the dust, was clean. Inside the darkroom, everything was organized with professional precision, chemicals arranged by type, developing trays nested and clean. The enlarger positioned perfectly over the baseboard. Someone had been maintaining this space, not just using it, but caring for it the way a darkroom should be cared for. The locked room at the end of the hall waited. Sarah unlocked it, pushed the door open, and stepped into a space that had been transformed. The filing cabinets were no longer simply arranged. They were organized into something that resembled an exhibition. Labels had been added, discrete placards explaining the dates each drawer covered, the number of subjects contained within. The photographs on the walls had been arranged into a chronological timeline, showing Harrison Hartley's progression from young photographer to old man, with the images of subjects interspersed throughout, creating a narrative of decades spent documenting lives. In the center of the room, a new piece of furniture had appeared, a small table with a single chair positioned before it. On the table lay an open journal, its pages filled with the now familiar handwriting, and beside it, a photograph. Sarah approached slowly and looked at the image. It showed her sitting at this table, in this chair, reading the journal. The photograph was dated tomorrow. Sarah stared at the photograph showing her future self, dated tomorrow, sitting at a table that now existed in front of her. The logical part of her mind insisted this was manipulation, trickery, someone with photo editing skills, creating an elaborate hoax. But the paper was old photographic stock, the kind that hadn't been manufactured in years. The developing marks were authentic. The image showed grain patterns consistent with film photography, not digital fabrication. This was not a computer trick. This was something else entirely. She backed away from the table without touching the journal, closed the door, locked it, and climbed the stairs with measured steps that fought against the panic rising in her chest. Dr. Voss would arrive in 3 hours. 3 hours to compose herself, to organize her thoughts, to prepare an explanation that didn't sound like complete madness. She sat in the reception area and made notes on her phone, listing everything in order: the cameras, the portrait archive, the darkroom evidence, the security footage, the impossible photographs. Facts first, speculation later. Let the expert draw conclusions. At precisely 11 o'clock, a silver sedan pulled up outside, and 2 women emerged. The first was in her 50s, with gray hair pulled into a practical bun and the kind of competent energy that came from decades of fieldwork. She carried 2 large equipment cases and approached with the confidence of someone used to strange situations. The second woman was younger, perhaps late 20s, with an eager expression and a messenger bag stuffed with notebooks and camera equipment. "Miss Chen?" the older woman said, extending her hand. "Elena Voss. This is my graduate student, Maya Reeves. Thank you for allowing us access to the space. Sarah shook both their hands, grateful for the normalcy of professional introduction, and led them inside. Dr. Voss paused in the reception area, her eyes sweeping across the straightened portraits, and Sarah saw the subtle shift in her expression. Recognition, not surprise, but the look of someone whose theories were being confirmed. Victorian portrait studio aesthetic, Dr. Voss said, moving closer to examine the photographs, but maintained past the era. These are from different decades, 50s, 60s, even some that look more recent. She turned to Sarah. You said on the phone that the original owner operated here from 1952 to 2018. That's 66 years of continuous operation in an era when most portrait studios transitioned to digital or closed entirely. That alone is unusual. Sarah nodded and began her explanation, walking them through the building's history, the auction, the camera collection she had discovered. Dr. Voss listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, while Maya photographed the reception area from multiple angles. When Sarah mentioned the portrait archive in the basement, Dr. Voss's attention sharpened. How extensive? She asked. Thousands of subjects? Tens of thousands? I haven't counted exactly, Sarah admitted, but there are dozens of filing cabinets, each with multiple drawers, each drawer holding hundreds of portraits. If I had to estimate, maybe 50 or 60,000 individual subjects spanning 7 decades. Dr. Voss and Maya exchanged glances. That's not a collection, Dr. Voss said quietly. That's a life's work elevated to obsession. Show us. Sarah led them to the basement, down the hallway to the locked room. Before opening it, she paused and explained what she had found that morning. The rearrangement, the cleaning, the table, and journal. The photograph dated tomorrow. Dr. Voss absorbed this information with the same calm focus, then said, Let me see the photograph first, before we enter. I want to examine it in context. Sarah unlocked the door and stood aside. Dr. Voss entered slowly, Maya following close behind, both of them scanning the space with practiced efficiency. They approached the table in the center of the room, and Dr. Voss studied the photograph without touching it. After a long moment, she pulled a jeweler's loupe from her equipment case and examined the image more closely, checking the paper, the grain, the developing marks. This is gelatin silver print, she said, more to Maya than to Sarah. Fiber-based paper, probably Ilford or Kodak stock from the early 2000s, before they changed their formulations. The grain pattern is consistent with medium-format film, likely a Hasselblad or Rolleiflex. The exposure is perfect. The focus is sharp. This was made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She lowered the loupe and looked at Sarah. When did you say this appeared? Sometime between yesterday evening and this morning, Sarah replied. I last checked the room 3 days ago. The table wasn't here then. The photograph wasn't here then. Dr. Voss nodded slowly. And the date on the photograph says tomorrow, which means either someone is making predictions or time in this space doesn't function the way we typically understand it. She turned to Maya. Start documenting everything. Positions, angles, lighting conditions. I want a complete record before we touch anything. While Maya worked, Dr. Voss examined the filing cabinets, opening drawers at random, studying the portraits with careful attention. Sarah watched as the anthropologist's expression shifted from academic curiosity to something deeper. She pulled files, examined images, checked dates and labels, and gradually her movements became more purposeful. Miss Chen, she said after 20 minutes, do you know what you have here? Sarah shook her head. A portrait archive. Disturbing. possibly illegal, created by an obsessive photographer who believed his subjects existed somehow in their images. Dr. Voss set down the file she had been holding and turned to face Sarah fully. You have documentation of an entire community across 7 decades. Every portrait here represents not just a person, but a moment, a relationship, a transaction between subject and photographer. These are not random snapshots. They're formal portraits, taken with consent in most cases, paid for, delivered to clients. They're social documents, historical records. But many of them were taken without consent, Sarah objected. The candid shots, the surveillance images. Dr. Voss acknowledged this with a nod. Yes, and that's where it becomes complicated. But the formal portraits, the ones that constitute the majority of this archive, they're legitimate. They're also potentially invaluable to historians, sociologists, genealogists. This kind of continuous photographic record of a single community is extraordinarily rare. Sarah felt her understanding shift. She had been focused on the disturbing aspects, the invasion of privacy, the obsessive continuation past death. She hadn't considered that the legitimate portions of the archive might have value beyond the emotional and ethical questions they raised. You're saying this collection is worth something? She asked carefully. Dr. Voss smiled slightly. I'm saying it's worth studying. Whether it has monetary value depends on several factors we haven't yet explored. But academically, historically, yes. This is significant. She gestured to Maya. Let's examine the darkroom next. I want to see where these recent photographs were developed. They moved down the hallway to the darkroom. Sarah opened the door and stepped aside, letting Dr. Voss enter first. The red safe light was off now, and in the harsh overhead fluorescent glow, the space looked ordinary, just a darkroom, equipment and chemicals and trays arranged for work. But Dr. Voss approached each element with forensic attention, examining the chemical bottles, testing the contents of the developing trays with litmus strips she produced from her equipment case. These are standard photographic chemicals, she said, reading the results. Developer, stop bath, fixer. Nothing unusual about the formulations. She moved to the enlarger, examining its settings, checking the lens. High-quality equipment, well-maintained. This could produce museum-grade prints if used correctly. She paused, looking around the room more carefully. But there should be more. If someone was using Hartley's special process, the one described in his journals, there should be additional chemicals, non-standard compounds. Sarah remembered the filing cabinet in the locked room, the drawer labeled Process, that held Hartley's technical notes. There were instructions, she said, notes about a special developing procedure, chemicals I didn't recognize, long exposure times, multiple baths. Dr. Voss's interest intensified immediately. Show me, she said. Back in the locked room, Sarah retrieved the file from the cabinet and handed it to Dr. Voss. The anthropologist read through the technical notes slowly, her expression growing more puzzled with each page. These formulations, she said finally, they're not photographic chemistry as I understand it. Some of the compounds he's describing were used in early experiments with color photography in the 1930 seconds. Others are completely unknown to me. He's mixing silver halide processes with something else, something that shouldn't work. She looked up at Sarah. But if the photographs exist, if they were produced using these methods, then somehow it did work. We need to test the actual prints, analyze their chemical composition, understand what makes them different from standard photographs. She turned to Maya. Do we have the spectrometer? Maya nodded and began unpacking more equipment from the cases they had brought. For the next 2 hours, Sarah watched as Dr. Voss and Maya conducted a methodical examination of the portrait archive. They selected prints at random, tested them with various instruments, measured their light absorption, analyzed the silver content, documented their findings. The process was slow, technical, and increasingly focused on a subset of photographs that all shared certain characteristics. They were older prints, from the 1960 seconds and 70 seconds, and when examined under specific wavelengths of light, they showed patterns that shouldn't exist. "Look at this," Dr. Voss said, projecting an ultraviolet light onto one of the portraits. The image of a middle-aged woman sitting in a studio chair should have shown uniform silver deposits, the normal result of photographic development. Instead, it showed layered patterns, as if the silver had been deposited in multiple passes, creating depth that went beyond the surface of the paper. "This isn't a single exposure," Dr. Voss explained. "This is multiple images superimposed, but not through double exposure, through something else, as if the paper itself was sensitized multiple times." Maya pointed to another anomaly visible under the UV light. Behind the woman's figure, barely visible, were shapes, not part of the original exposure, but present nonetheless. Shadows that suggested other people standing in spaces where the studio background should have been empty. "It's like the photograph is showing two realities simultaneously," Maya said, her voice carrying equal parts fascination and unease. The intentional portrait and something else that was there but invisible to normal perception. Dr. Voss tested more prints and found the same pattern, not in all of them, but in a significant percentage. The older the photograph, the more pronounced the effect. The images from the 1950 seconds showed the clearest anomalies, layers of information that shouldn't exist in standard photographic prints. Hartley was doing something with his process that changed how the film and paper captured light, Dr. Voss said, her academic composure beginning to show cracks. "I don't know how to explain this scientifically, but these photographs contain more information than they should, more than the physics of photography allows." Sarah felt vindication mixed with deeper unease. She wasn't crazy. The photographs were genuinely unusual. But understanding that they were unusual didn't explain what they actually were or why they existed. "What does this mean?" she asked. Dr. Voss carefully returned the print she had been examining to its file. "It means we need to bring in specialists, chemists who understand historical photographic processes, physicists who can analyze the light capture properties. This is beyond my expertise alone." She paused, then added, "It also means that whatever Hartley discovered or created here, it was real. Not supernatural, but some kind of photographic process that achieved results we can't yet explain. That makes these prints unique, scientifically valuable, possibly the only examples of this technique in existence." Sarah's mind raced ahead to implications. Valuable how? Monetarily? Dr. Voss hesitated, clearly uncomfortable putting a price on scientific anomaly. "That would depend on authentication, on proving the process can't be replicated, on finding institutions or collectors interested in photographic history at the bleeding edge of what's technically possible. But yes, potentially. These aren't just portraits anymore. They're evidence of an unknown photographic technique that makes them research materials. That makes them worth." She trailed off, calculating. "I honestly don't know. Thousands per print? Tens of thousands? More if the technique truly can't be replicated." Sarah did the math. If even a fraction of the 50,000 portraits in the archive showed these anomalies, if each one was worth thousands rather than dozens of dollars, the total value could be extraordinary. Far beyond the camera collection, far beyond anything she had imagined when she bought the building. "We need to document this properly," Dr. Voss said. already planning next steps. Full chemical analysis, photography under multiple spectrums, documentation of which prints show the anomalies and which don't, chain of custody for everything. This needs to be published, peer-reviewed, authenticated by multiple sources. She looked at Sarah directly. This will take time. Months, possibly years, to do properly. But when we're finished, you'll have one of the most significant photographic archives in private hands. Museums will want access. Universities will want to study it. Collectors who specialize in photographic history will want to acquire pieces. You'll need lawyers, contracts, agreements about reproduction rights, and research access. The scope of it overwhelmed Sarah. She had bought a building for $950, expecting to sell cameras for a few $100,000 and rebuild her life. Now she was being told she owned something scientifically significant, historically important, potentially worth millions. "I don't know how to do any of this," she admitted. "Doctor." Voss smiled with understanding. "You don't have to. That's what specialists are for. Let me make some calls. I know people at major institutions who would jump at the chance to study this. We'll build a team, get proper authentication. When we announce this discovery, it will be credible, documented, unassailable." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life transformed in ways she struggled to process. Dr. Voss brought in a chemist from MIT who specialized in 19th-century photographic processes. He spent 3 days examining the prints, testing their composition, confirming that the chemical formulations Hartley had used were unprecedented. A physicist from Stanford arrived with equipment that analyzed how light interacted with the silver deposits and confirmed the layering effect that created depth beyond normal photographic principles. A historian of photography from the Getty Museum examined the archive's scope and declared it the most comprehensive single photographer collection of a specific community she had ever encountered. An appraiser who specialized in photographic ephemera studied the documentation, the testing results, and the historical context, then provided a preliminary estimate that made Sarah's hands shake when she read it. The portrait archive, properly authenticated and marketed to institutional buyers, could be worth between $40 and $60 million. But that wasn't the most valuable discovery. That came when Dr. Voss, working late one evening in the locked room, noticed something about the filing cabinets themselves. They were not standard office furniture. They were custom-built, constructed from materials designed to preserve photographic materials in stable conditions. And they were sealed. Not locked, but sealed, with gaskets that created an environment separated from the room's ambient air. When they opened one of the sealed cabinets that Sarah had not yet examined, they found something extraordinary: negatives. Not the standard film negatives Sarah had seen before, but large format glass plate negatives, each one stored in an individual sleeve, each one labeled with dates going back to the 1,890 seconds. Hartley had not simply operated a portrait studio starting in 1952. He had acquired or inherited a collection that predated his own work by 60 years. These glass plates represented an even earlier era of photography, and they were in nearly perfect condition, preserved in the sealed environment Hartley had created. Dr. Voss examined them with reverent care. "Glass plate negatives from this era are rare," she explained. "Most were destroyed or degraded, but these are pristine. The images they contain can be printed now with the same quality they would have had when first created." And if Hartley's special process was applied to these glass plates, she trailed off, testing one under UV light. The same anomalies appeared, the same layering, the same impossible depth. "He was refining a technique that went back generations," Dr. Voss said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This wasn't just his discovery. He inherited knowledge, perfected it, preserved it. These glass plates are the foundation of everything he did later. They're the proof that this process existed before him and that he made it better. The appraiser was called back. He examined the glass plate collection, which numbered over 7,000 individual negatives, and revised his estimate. The combined value of the portrait archive, the glass plate negatives, and the documentation of Hartley's unique process totaled between $600 and $700 million. Sarah heard the number and felt her mind go blank. It was not a sum she could conceptualize. It was not money in any meaningful sense. It was abstraction. The appraiser, seeing her shock, explained patiently, "This is not money you'll see in a bank account tomorrow. This is the estimated value if the entire collection is sold through institutional channels over several years. Museums will acquire portions for their permanent collections. Universities will bid on research rights. Private collectors will pay premium prices for the most significant pieces. It will take time. It will require proper representation. But yes, this is what you own." Dr. Voss added gently, "You'll want to work with major auction houses, with lawyers who specialize in art and historical collections, with tax specialists who understand how to handle assets of this magnitude. Don't make any decisions quickly. Don't sign anything without multiple experts reviewing it. What you have here will change your life, but only if you manage it carefully." Sarah returned home that evening in a daze. Emma greeted her with excitement about a project she wanted to start, something involving bottle rockets and vinegar. Sarah helped with the usual distraction, the grateful normalcy of problems that had solutions. But after Emma was asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and began making lists, not of what to buy or how to spend, but of what needed to happen next. Lawyers, accountants, institutions to contact, museums to approach. The immediate crisis was solved. The eviction notice that had driven her to the auction could be resolved with a single phone call now. Emma's future, which had felt so precarious, was secured beyond anything Sarah had dared imagine. But the magnitude of what she had discovered brought its own weight. She owned something significant. She had responsibilities now, not just to herself and Emma, but to history, to the people documented in those portraits, to the knowledge Hartley had preserved. Over the following months, the process of authentication and institutional outreach unfolded exactly as Dr. Voss had predicted, slowly, methodically, with careful legal protections at every stage. Sarah hired lawyers who specialized in major collections. She worked with archivists who helped create a complete catalog of the portraits. She negotiated agreements with museums that wanted to acquire portions of the archive for research and exhibition. The first major sale was announced 6 months after her discovery. The Getty Museum acquired 2,000 of the glass plate negatives for their permanent collection, paying $23 million for materials they intended to preserve, study, and eventually make available to researchers worldwide. The announcement made national news. "Unknown photographic process discovered in small-town archive," read one headline. "Photographer's secret technique preserved for century," read another. Sarah found herself interviewed by magazines and news programs, explaining how she had bought a building at auction and discovered what it contained. She kept the story simple, focusing on the cameras and the archive, downplaying the disturbing aspects of surveillance and obsession. The public narrative became about preservation and discovery rather than the darker elements she had experienced. That suited her. The world didn't need to know about the figure in the darkroom, or the photograph dated tomorrow, or the sense that the building itself was aware of her presence. Those experiences remained private, shared only with Dr. Voss, who had her own theories but kept them professional. Whatever Hartley was doing with his process, it affected how people experienced being photographed, she said once. in a moment of candor. Subjects reported feeling observed long after their sessions ended. That suggests a psychological component to his technique. He convinced people their images held power, and belief shaped their experience. It's not supernatural. It's the power of suggestion combined with an unusual photographic process, but it's no less real for being psychological. Sarah accepted that explanation because it was the only one that allowed her to sleep at night. She sold the building itself 6 months later, once the archive had been fully documented and removed to climate-controlled storage. The new owner was a developer who planned to convert it into apartments. Sarah warned them about the darkroom, about the portrait archive that had been there, about the need to seal and renovate carefully. They thanked her and assured her they would gut the space completely. Nothing from the old studio would remain. A year after the auction, Sarah moved Emma into a house. Not a mansion or estate, nothing ostentatious. A 3-bedroom home in a good school district, with a yard and trees, and space for Emma to grow. They furnished it slowly, choosing pieces together, making decisions based on what they liked, rather than what they could afford. The relief of that freedom never fully faded. The anxiety that had defined Sarah's life for years took months to unwind, leaving her lighter but also strangely unanchored. Emma adapted faster than Sarah did. Children were resilient that way. The new school, the new neighborhood, the shift from poverty to security happened for Emma in the natural way childhood allows. She made friends, joined clubs, thrived in ways that broke Sarah's heart with gratitude. Watching her daughter grow without the weight of financial fear was worth everything Sarah had risked. The sales continued. Stanford acquired 500 prints, showing the most pronounced anomalies for their physics department to study light capture properties. A private collector in Japan paid $4 million for a complete set of Hartley's journals and technical notes. The Smithsonian entered negotiations for a major acquisition that would include both portraits and glass plates, creating an exhibit on the evolution of photographic techniques from the 1,890 seconds through the 2,010 seconds. Each sale brought money that Sarah invested carefully, following advice from financial advisors who understood sudden wealth. She paid off every debt. She established trust funds for Emma's education and future. She contributed to museums and historical societies. She donated to organizations that helped families in crisis, remembering what it felt like to stand at the edge of collapse. Money, she learned, was not happiness, but it was freedom. It was the absence of certain fears. It was the luxury of thinking about tomorrow without dread. 2 years after buying the building, Sarah received a call from Dr. Voss. The anthropologist's voice carried excitement, barely contained by professional composure. "We've made another discovery," she said. "One of my graduate students was reviewing the technical notes, the ones from Hartley's special process, and she found something we missed, a reference to a master negative. A single image that Hartley claimed demonstrated his technique at its most refined. He hid it somewhere in the building. We never found it during our original documentation." Sarah felt a familiar unease return. "The building's been sold," she said. "It's being renovated. If there's something still there, the construction crew would have found it." Dr. Voss was silent for a moment. "Maybe," she said, "but the note suggests it was hidden in a way that would survive renovation. Behind walls, under floors, somewhere permanent. If it still exists, if we can find it, it could be the key to understanding exactly how his process worked." Sarah didn't want to return to that building. She had closed that chapter of her life, but the discovery that had transformed her future deserved completion. "I'll call the developer," she said. "Ask permission to examine the space one more time." The developer was accommodating. explaining that the renovation was halfway complete. The basement had been sealed and converted into storage units. The upper floors were being divided into apartments, but they would allow access if it didn't interfere with construction. Sarah returned to Riverside on a cold afternoon in late November, Emma beside her in the passenger seat. Her daughter was 10 now, old enough to understand some of what had happened, curious about the building that had changed their lives. They parked outside and looked up at the facade. It appeared different, cleaner, windows replaced, the old sign removed. It was becoming something new, erasing the history that Sarah alone still carried. They entered through a construction entrance, hard hats provided by the foreman. The interior was barely recognizable. Walls had been removed. New framing marked where apartments would be. Dust filled the air. But when they descended to the basement, Sarah recognized the hallway, now shorter than she remembered, but unmistakable. The darkroom door was gone. The space behind it converted into a storage unit. The locked room at the end of the hall was sealed behind new drywall. Dr. Voss met them there with 2 graduate students and scanning equipment. "We're going to use ground-penetrating radar," she explained. "Look for voids in the walls or floors where something might be hidden." Hartley's note said the master negative was placed where light couldn't reach it, where time couldn't touch it. That suggests deliberate concealment in a sealed space. They spent hours scanning the walls, the floors, the ceiling joists. The equipment showed the normal construction elements, pipes, and wiring and structural beams. But in one corner, where the locked room had been, the scan showed an anomaly, a void space between walls, too regular to be accidental construction gap. Something was sealed inside. The foreman allowed them to cut through the drywall carefully. Behind it, they found original brick, and set into the brick, a metal box no larger than a shoebox, welded shut and marked with a single date, 1954. Dr. Voss documented everything before removing the box. They carried it outside into daylight and examined it carefully. The welds were old but solid. Opening it would require tools and time. "We'll take it to the lab," Dr. Voss said. "Open it under controlled conditions. Document whatever's inside properly." She looked at Sarah. "Do you want to be there when we open it? This is your discovery. You have the right to see what it contains first." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. She had come this far. She would see it through. A week later, Sarah stood in Dr. Voss's laboratory at the university, watching as a technician carefully cut through the welds on the metal box. Emma waited at home with a sitter, too young for what might be a disappointing conclusion. The box opened with a hiss of air, the seal breaking after 70 years. Inside, wrapped in layers of protective fabric, was a single piece of glass, an 8 by 10 negative, perfectly preserved, its emulsion intact. Dr. Voss lifted it with gloved hands and held it up to the light. The image was dense, difficult to read, in negative, but unmistakable. It showed Hartley's studio, empty, except for a single chair and a camera on a tripod. But when Dr. Voss moved it under UV light, the same light that had revealed anomalies in other prints, the image transformed. The empty studio filled with figures, hundreds of them. All the subjects Hartley had photographed over his lifetime, all present simultaneously, arranged in rows as if for a group portrait. Their faces were clear, their eyes open. They looked at the camera with that same evaluating expression Hartley had worn in his self-portraits. "It's everyone," Maya whispered. "Everyone." He photographed. All of them together, as if they were always there, just invisible to normal perception. Dr. Voss set the negative down carefully on the examination table. "This is what he was working toward," she said. "Not just capturing individual moments, but capturing the accumulation of moments. creating an image that contained all his subjects at once. It's impossible. It defies everything we know about photography. But here it is. She looked at Sarah. If we can print this, if we can reproduce what's visible under UV light in a form others can see, this single image will be the most valuable photograph in existence. Museums will bid against each other for it. Collectors will offer amounts I can't even estimate. This is the proof of Hartley's technique, the masterwork he spent his life creating. The process of printing the master negative took months. Specialists were brought in. New techniques were developed to capture the UV visible information onto paper that could be viewed without special equipment. When the final print was completed, Sarah stood before it in a gallery at the Getty Museum and looked at the faces of people she recognized. Mrs. Chen was there, standing in the crowd. So was the woman from the laundromat, the mailman, people from the town she had grown up in, documented by Hartley over decades, now preserved together in a single, impossible image. The print was auctioned privately to a consortium of 3 major museums who would share custody, rotating it between their collections. The price was $68 million. When added to the previous sales, the total value realized from Hartley's archive exceeded $678 million. Sarah's share, after lawyers, taxes, and the various agreements she had made with researchers and institutions, was still more than she could spend in a lifetime. The vindication came quietly, in small moments, rather than dramatic announcements. Mrs. Chen, who had watched Emma when Sarah couldn't afford childcare, received a check for $500,000, with a note thanking her for her kindness during difficult times. The neighbor who had lent tools was hired to manage properties Sarah now owned. People who had doubted her, who had questioned her sanity when she spoke about impossible photographs and surveillance, read the news coverage and said nothing. Their silence was acknowledgement enough. Emma grew into a teenager who understood that her mother had taken a risk when everything was on the line, and it had paid off. But she also understood that the risk had been terrifying, that the year of discovery had cost Sarah something in peace and certainty. They talked about it sometimes, late at night when Emma couldn't sleep and wanted to hear the story again. Sarah always told it the same way, truthfully, but without embellishment. A building, an auction, a gamble that could have gone wrong, cameras that were valuable, an archive that was more valuable, a photographic process that defied explanation but existed nonetheless. "Do you think the photographs really contained the people?" Emma asked once, when she was old enough to understand the question. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I think Hartley believed they did," she said, finally. And belief shaped how he worked, how he photographed people, how he preserved the images. Whether his subjects exist in the photographs in any literal sense, I don't know. But their images exist. Their moments exist. Their faces and stories are preserved. That's real enough. 5 years after the auction, Sarah stood in the National Museum of American History and watched families move through the exhibition of Hartley's work. The curators had done an excellent job presenting the archive in context, explaining both the technical innovation and the ethical questions it raised. The master print hung in the final gallery, protected by climate control and low lighting, with an explanation plaque that called it one of the most significant photographs in the history of the medium. Sarah no longer felt the unease she had carried during her early days in the building. The photographs had been removed from that space, properly preserved, made accessible to researchers and the public. Whatever presence had existed in the locked room, whatever sense of being watched she had experienced, had dissipated once the archive was no longer concentrated in a single location. Distributed across museums and collections worldwide, Hartley's work had become what it was always meant to be, not surveillance, but documentation, Not obsession, but preservation. Emma found her in the gallery, having wandered through the exhibition on her own. At 15, she was almost as tall as Sarah, with the same determined expression her mother wore when facing difficult decisions. "It's weird to think about," Emma said, looking at the master print, "that you bought all of this for $950, that everything changed because you raised your hand." Sarah smiled. "Everything changed because I didn't know when to walk away," she corrected gently. "I should have stopped a dozen times. When the police didn't believe me, when the photographs became too strange, when it would have been easier to just sell the cameras and leave the rest alone. But I kept going. Sometimes stupidity looks like courage until after it works out." Emma laughed. "Mom, you're rich. You're allowed to call it courage now." Sarah put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I'm not rich," she said. "I'm secure. We're secure. There's a difference. Rich is about having more than you need. Secure is about having enough that you stop being afraid. That's what the building gave us. Not wealth, but the absence of fear." They left the museum together as afternoon light stretched across the National Mall. Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from her financial advisor, from Dr. Voss, from the lawyer handling her latest charitable donation. She ignored them all for now. Tomorrow was soon enough for business. Tonight was for Emma, for dinner somewhere Emma chose, for being present in a life that no longer required constant calculation of costs and consequences. As they walked, Sarah thought about the photograph still hidden in her home office, the one showing her sitting at the table in the locked room, reading Hartley's journal, dated for the day after she had seen it. She had taken that photograph from the building, the only piece of the archive she had kept for herself. It remained in a drawer, unsealed and unexamined, a reminder that some questions didn't need answers. She didn't know how Hartley had created an image of her future. She didn't know whether time in that building worked differently or whether her memory of seeing the photograph was false, shaped by stress into something that felt supernatural but wasn't. She didn't need to know. The photograph existed. She had seen it. Whether it was proof of impossible prescience or simply a trick of perception and timing didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what came after, the choices made, the risks taken, the willingness to see discovery through even when it was uncomfortable. Hartley had built something extraordinary in that building, whether he intended to or not. He had created a technique that pushed the boundaries of what photography could do. And Sarah had recognized that significance, even when it frightened her, had preserved it properly, had made sure it reached people who could understand and appreciate it. That night, after Emma was asleep in her room in the house they owned, Sarah sat on the porch and looked up at stars that had watched over the building during all the years Hartley worked there. She thought of him sometimes, the man who had lived above his studio, who had dedicated his life to capturing and preserving moments. She hoped he would have approved of what became of his work. Distributed, studied, respected, not hidden anymore, not forgotten. The cameras she had sold long ago were scattered now, in collections around the world, each one a small piece of photographic history. The portrait archive continued to reveal insights to researchers, helping them understand how a single community changed over 7 decades, how photography shaped identity and memory. And the master print hung in galleries, challenging viewers to consider what photographs really captured, what persisted beyond the moment of exposure. Sarah had not become famous. The media coverage faded after a few months, replaced by other stories, other discoveries. She preferred that. Fame came with scrutiny she didn't want. Her life now was ordinary in the best possible way. Emma's school events, quiet weekends, decisions made without fear. The building had given her that. A single impulsive bid at an auction, $950, she couldn't afford to lose, had opened a door she walked through even when every instinct said to turn back. She thought of the other people at the auction that day, the ones who had looked at the red door and walked away. They had been smart, cautious, reasonable. Sarah had been desperate, willing to gamble, because having nothing made risk feel less dangerous than standing still. Sometimes desperation looked like courage. Sometimes courage looked like stupidity. The only difference was outcome, and outcome was never certain until after decisions were made. A car passed on the street, headlights briefly illuminating the porch where Sarah sat. She watched it disappear and checked her phone one final time before bed. Dr. Voss had sent a message about a new paper coming out, analyzing the chemical composition of Hartley's prints, offering hypotheses about how his process achieved its unique effects. Sarah made a note to read it tomorrow, then set the phone aside. The house around her settled into its evening sounds, the refrigerator humming, the heater clicking on, Emma's soft breathing from upstairs. These were the sounds of security, of a life built from the wreckage of the one she had been living when she drove to Westline Storage that Saturday morning. She had been terrified then. She was grateful now. The distance between those two feelings was measured not in time but in choices, in moments when walking away would have been easier, but staying proved wiser. As Sarah went inside and locked the door behind her, she understood that the story of the building would continue without her. Researchers would publish papers, museums would mount exhibitions. Hartley's technique would be studied and perhaps eventually replicated. But for Sarah, the story was complete. She had found what was hidden. She had recognized its value. She had made sure it was preserved properly. The rest belonged to history. In the drawer of her office desk, the photograph dated tomorrow waited in darkness. Sarah didn't open the drawer, didn't check to see if the image had changed or faded, or somehow updated itself. Some mysteries were better left alone. Some questions didn't need answers. The photograph had served its purpose. It had shown her that the building contained possibilities she couldn't predict, that taking the next step required trust, even when understanding was incomplete. That lesson was worth more than the paper it was printed on. The life Sarah built from the discovery wasn't perfect. There were hard days, moments when wealth created new problems to replace the old ones. Decisions about how much to give, how much to keep, how to raise a daughter who would never know the fear that had defined Sarah's early motherhood. But these were problems of fortune, not survival. They were challenges she faced with resources rather than desperation. That made all the difference. Years later, when Emma graduated from college debt-free, when she chose a career based on passion rather than necessity, when she talked about traveling and art and experiences that Sarah could support without hesitation, Sarah thought back to the building one more time. She remembered standing on the sidewalk with the keys in her hand, staring at a door that opened onto darkness and possibility. She remembered the moment she stepped inside, committed, no longer able to turn back. She remembered thinking this would either save them or confirm every bad decision she had made. She had been right. It had saved them. But more than that, it had taught her something about herself, that she was willing to keep going even when it was terrifying, that she could face impossible things and not break. That fear was not a reason to stop, but a signal that something important was at stake. The building had tested her in ways she didn't expect and would never have chosen, and she had passed, not perfectly, not without doubt, but decisively. That was worth more than $678 million. That was worth everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.